It's amazing the people in our lives who can change our lives just by being themselves. Like they don't set an example that we have to emulate, but they set an example of what true happy authenticity looks like. And someone just like walking their own path. And you're like, oh yeah, that's an inspiration for me to walk my own path, not to walk yours.
You nailed it, Eric. You summarized my last 10 minutes in 30 seconds. You nailed it. It's the inspiration to be yourself, not to try to be someone else.
Yeah.
And the courage in today's world to be comfortable with yourself, whatever that is. And that's especially hard with all the stuff. I mean, it was hard when I was a kid. It's probably been hard for the beginning of our species. It's especially hard with the amount of stuff that comes at you every day.
Yeah.
All the different stuff about how to be and what you should and what you shouldn't and what's good and what's bad, all the nonsense and, the number of people who are, just whatever the bullshit that's coming out of their mouth is because they're trying to accomplish something. All right, well, whatever.
We've invented some, mimetic super weapons in the last couple of years that really prey on our natural weaknesses. Hello again and welcome. I'm Eric Jorgensen. Today, I want you to meet Brad Feld, a renowned venture capitalist, entrepreneur, and author, best known as the co-founder of Techstars and most recently the Foundry Group. Brad has been at the center of startup investing for decades, shaping the conversation around mentorship, startup communities, and the philosophy of give before you get. Brad has written 9 books, including Venture Deals, Startup Communities, and Startup Boards, and a handful of others. His most recent book, Give First, explores the power of mentorship and long-term relationships in the startup world. In this episode, we have a very personal conversation about his mentors, the mentors that shaped his career, from his uncle Charlie Feld to his sort of personal Yoda, as he says, Len Fassler, and the lessons that they imparted to him. We talk about the magic of mentorship and spend most of the second half of the conversation about books and how writing books and becoming an author shaped Brad's career and opened up new opportunities. Brad's somebody I've learned a ton from and looked up to over the last 20 years in the startup and venture investing world, and it was really cool to have a conversation with him. I hope you enjoy joining us for it. I don't do outside podcast sponsors, but as always, I invite you to invest alongside me through my fund, Rolling Fun. We make it our mission to provide capital to obsessive geniuses building utopian technologies. And if you want to support us in supporting them, please open your browser right now and type in rolling.fun. More than 100 listeners like you now invest alongside me in these early stage tech startups, and I'm honored by that. This is open to accredited investors, and you can start through AngelList today. And with a rolling fund, the sooner you invest, the more deals you get to participate in. If you want to put your money to work alongside ours, click on rolling.fun or type it in. It's linked in the show notes below. If you want to learn more, have a quick conversation about it, please reach out through Twitter or email. Now, I invite you to take a deep breath, relax, and enjoy smart friends arriving at your ears in 3, 2, 1. You are a legend among venture capitalists, having venture capital since the 1900s, as is fashionable to say now.
1873.
Pre-millennium. I like to start, and it's one of my favorite, just like get to know you questions at dinner with like, who are your heroes?
I have so many heroes. Zaphod Beeblebrox is a hero of mine.
Why is that? That's an unconventional choice, but I like it.
Well, I read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when it first came out, and I fell in love with Douglas Adams, the writer. I actually saw him once when I was at MIT, he came and gave a talk, and he's since passed, but he was like 12 feet tall and just unbelievably hilarious. And for people who don't know Zaphod Beeblebrox, he was the president of the universe. And, he was a knucklehead, but he had some great lines. My favorite of his is, the best way to fly is to throw yourself at the ground and miss. And for me, so much of creating companies is to throw yourself at the ground and miss. Like, you just try shit and hopefully you don't fail. I had an investment in a company called Harmonix that was started by these guys, Alex and Aran. Harmonix did Guitar Hero and Rock Band. And they had a huge overnight success that for the first 10 years, a massively successful company.
Hmm.
For the first 10 years of their life, they tried very, very hard every year to go out of business and were unsuccessful. So that's Zaphod. I have always loved Albert Einstein as a thinker. His willingness and ability to think on his own was sort of an inspiration to me. Warren Buffett is another business example of a hero for me. He just did his own thing his way. Lots of people didn't get it. Some people did. He held true to his values for a very long time, over a very long time, very consistently.
Mm-hmm.
And, he's open now about some of his ups and downs in life, but he really just tried to wake up every day and do his thing. His partner, Charlie Munger, who passed, would be another one in that category. I find Charlie to be inscrutably wonderful. There you go. And he reminds me of another hero, the guy up on my first company. His name is Len Fassler. And Len passed a few years ago, but I learned more from Len, not just about business, but about how to comport oneself in life than I think I have from almost anyone else. So those are some of the heroes on that side. Interestingly, current heroes of mine that are contemporary, Paula Johnson, who's the head of Wellesley College, where my wife Amy went to school, in my mind is a totally heroic figure in terms of what she's done in life and how she does it. A woman, Lucy Sanders, who I'm very close with, who created the National Center for Women in Information Technology. I was the founding chair of it. Probably has had the most to do with girls and women getting involved in computer science over the last 20 years. Amazing what she's done. Another person I'll just call out that's also contemporary is a woman named Wendy Lee, who very successful entrepreneurial career, and for the last decade or so has really, first in Cincinnati and more recently in Colorado, dedicated herself to helping at the intersection between public policy and public service and entrepreneurship without being in government. And some of the stuff that she's done has just been awesome.
Yeah, it's a very a big and interesting ecosystem of all the people who try to support entrepreneurs. I'm part of how I came into this was actually through Startup Weekend and through the Kauffman Foundation, which I think are both things that you've worked closely with over the years. Just finding happy paths for people towards their own, starting their own companies or having their own form of success is. So many people have their hands on that over time.
Well, it's for me, it's awesome. Somebody says, well, hey, Brad, where do you fit in terms of how you think about yourself in the world? I love to help things get started. I've been involved in lots of things for long periods of time, but I really love the inception. So if you think about some things, you mentioned two organizations that I care a lot about. Startup Weekend, the very first Startup Weekend happened in Boulder in 2007 during the very first Techstars program. And then, for a number of years after Startup Weekend started to become a thing, I ended up on the Startup Weekend board. And then over time, Startup Weekend ended up merging into Techstars, which I was a co-founder of and still on the board of. Kauffman Foundation, which was a very early supporter of Startup Weekend, and Lisa Mitchell, close friend, who today is at Alloy Ventures, but was for a while at Techstars. Prior to that was at Kauffman, but preceding Lisa in the 1990s, I spent time at Kauffman. I got to know a woman, Jenna Matthews, through kind of a random linkage with some entrepreneurial stuff I was doing at MIT that Kauffman did. I ended up spending about a day a month for a couple of years in the 90s in Kansas City at the Kauffman Foundation, working with Jenna on a team she had that turned into a very bad acronym called, the program name was Learning Programs for High Growth Entrepreneurs. Our acronym was Leapfrog. Terrible acronym. But all of these things, the early stages of them, for me, so much joy in having them go. I didn't know you'd gotten involved via Startup Weekend. It just brings me great joy to know that touched you at the beginning of your startup journey. And for me, having to be in control, still be actively involved in that's not important to me. That's never been part of my shtick. And it's really fun as I'm about to turn 60, as I approach 60, to sort of look back and just, obviously I've had lots of companies and things that have been successful. I've had lots that have failed.
Yeah.
I think most of the joy doesn't come from those. The failures don't generate joy, but the successes, I don't even think are what generates joy. What generates joy is like all these little seeds all over the place that impacted people on their own journeys in ways that was meaningful. That's really joyful.
Yeah, I'm definitely one of those seeds. I mean, growing up as a kid in Detroit, Startup Weekend was my path from like I won a Twitter contest to go to a startup weekend, and that the judges introduced me to somebody who brought me to Kansas City, which brought me to Coffin, which then joined a company that was born at a different startup weekend, and that moved me to San Francisco, and that got me into the ecosystem, and got to meet all these incredible people and kind of create this cohort of people that came through Startup Weekend at the same time, and it's like it's been yeah, I'm one of the legions of people that kind of your forest has nurtured over the years, which is a really cool full circle moment. I'm curious, as a starter, like you love starting things. How do you know when to step away from something that you started? I imagine that's hard. You feel load bearing. You feel like your personality's wrapped up in this thing. Like that's a huge decision, and you've made it dozens of times now.
Yeah, well, there's two different dynamics associated with it for me, and I've had to understand how to separate them. They were hard, certainly when I was younger, and I'll separate them between things where I am in a key committed role. And I learned this from Len. A lot of VCs, when things go sideways, kind of walk away or stop paying attention, or that's not worth my time. A phrase I hate, which is return on invested time, or return on time. I don't like that. I don't like
Mm.
those phrases because they don't really apply. They don't make sense. I understand what people are saying with it, but they don't make sense to me in terms of my own value system. I learned from Len, you fight to the bitter end. I mean, you just try until it doesn't work anymore. And so for me, from the standpoint of things where I have functional responsibility, I'm a major shareholder because I'm an investor, I'm on the board, I'm a co-founder. I feel in those situations, I feel responsible to stay through the end, whatever the end is. Now, that doesn't mean that if I'm not wanted that I have to stay. And there have been some cases where it's clear that, my presence wasn't valued anymore, or there was no reason for me to be around. So that's different. But like my core is fight to the end. And, I got that from, I really did get that from Len. But I separate that from holding on to control.
Mm.
So one of the things that happened in the internet bubble for me, so this is 2000-ish, before the bubble burst, I had co-founded a number of companies, including a few that were before the bubble burst, very, very successful. And as co-founder of those companies, I was very deeply and emotionally involved in those businesses. But I also had invested in a lot of companies, both as an angel and then subsequently as a VC. And I was on an absurdly large number of boards. Somebody ended a podcast with it the other day by asking the question, was it true that? I'm like, geez, really? That's what we're going to end with?
I mean, what's an absurd number?
Well, I don't know the actual number. I don't remember. Like, I don't have it, but it was,
That's
it
high
was,
enough.
it was more than 25. The podcast question was it true that you were on 35 boards? I'm like, I have no idea if that was a number, but, and of that, it was, a handful, 4 public company boards, 5 international boards, and then just a ton of boards at all levels. When the internet bubble burst, I mean, my world was a gigantic pile of shit. But for me, again, this sort of one part of my brain that's like fight to the end, I separate that from the part of my brain which is hang on to control.
Mm.
So in the world where I was, the co-founder of some of these companies, I felt this overbearing emotional responsibility for the outcome. And so I felt this dynamic around control as an operator. As an investor, from day one, I knew I wasn't in control. The investor's
Mhm.
not in control. Your VC's not in control. The board member's not in control. The CEO is in control. The founder is in control. And my job as an investor board member, from my frame of reference, is as long as I support the CEO, my job is to help her be successful. And when I get to the point where for some reason I don't support her anymore, my job is to do something about it, which is not necessarily replace the CEO. It's to try to get back to a place where I support her.
Yeah.
And I had these two parts of my brain that were at war with each other, right? One of them was this sort of inappropriate sense of responsibility in a lot of cases for things I didn't have really the responsibility for, the ability to control. So that was 25 years ago. So in that time period, that's when I really learned sort of how to link these two ideas together. The one of them is fight to the end,
Mhm.
whatever that is. And the other, and some, some things don't end, right? Some things outlive you, which is delightful. But on the other side of it's to not have this inappropriate responsibility for things, not try to control what's going on. If you fast forward 10 years or a dozen years later to 2012, when I wrote Startup Communities, it was the book that I came out, was this third book that I wrote. One of the things that I wrote in that book was the importance of there'd be multiple leaders in a startup community, but not one leader try to control what's going on in the startup community. And one of the experiences I was having by this point in time was I had become very well known, both in Colorado, but also outside Colorado for many things I'd done. And, people would say, Brad's the king of the Colorado startup community, or the phrase startup community didn't exist at that point. So Brad's the king of Colorado startups, and Brad's the, person, blah, blah. And I fought that. I'm like, no, Brad's the leader. No, I'm one of the people who are leaders. I had a paragraph or a section in that book called the patriarch problem. And I said, one of the reasons that startup communities get stalled over time is that the people in control, which at the time were mostly older white guys, tried to hang on to control well past the point where they should. The key is that you constantly want new energy in the system. You want new people. You want the next generation. You want new leaders. And
Yeah.
so, like, I had this evolution of my own experience where I realized that, I was on, a bunch of nonprofit boards. I was chair of some things. And I woke up one day, I'm like, that's not being helpful, right? Because people are looking to me to control what's happening versus allowing those things to evolve and grow. And I can be just as influential and just as impactful without trying to be in control. And now as I approach 60, it's not an ageist statement, but the future does not belong to me. The future belongs to people who are 40 years younger than me.
Yeah.
And, part of what I can do is participate in constructive and helpful ways. But if you look at our society and you look at all the people late in life still hanging on to power and relevance, rather than contributing in really significant ways on the path of what the future generations want. It's so easy to say, I'm just doing this for my kids. I don't have any kids, but you're saying, doing this for my kids and for my kids' kids. And you look what the person's doing, you say, no, actually, you're doing that for your own ego.
Yeah.
You're doing that because you're maintaining relevance. You're doing that because you're trying to control the outcome in a certain way that suits you, that might or might not be the thing that other people want. And so in that 2012 timeframe, when I made that statement, I really committed personally to being a constructive force that was not having to be in control.
Yeah. That's a very interesting thing to segment, yeah, control and presence and how you show up in an organization and the level at which you choose to engage in it. Will you tell me more about Len?
Len was wonderful. I miss Len every day. So I met Len when I was 28 and he was probably about 60.
Mm.
And I was running a little company in Boston. It was very creatively named Feld Technologies. I like to say I named it after my dad. It had no funding. It was just me, a business partner, a guy named Dave Jilk, and my dad, who was an advisor, and we gave him some equity. We had 10 shares of stock, each $1. And we split them up, 6 to me, 3 to Dave, 1 to my dad. And when we sold the company, we still had 10 shares of stock. And fortunately, they were worth more than $1. And, we just built this business that ended up, being a really good business. We had a great culture internally. The team was a young team, mostly of software developers, and we were writing business applications for businesses, not just locally in Boston. We had clients all over the country, but we were writing business applications in the late 80s and early 90s when it was really hard on PCs to write stuff, write
Mhm.
software, to make networks connect to each other. where packaged applications weren't very configurable, where a lot of people were coming off mainframe or mini computer systems and trying to implement PC and PC-based networks. And so our motto as a company became "We suck less." And that was our motto because we were often the second or third company a company had hired to
Yeah.
do this. The first one or two had failed. And we would sit down in the first meeting and say, well, we've been at this for 2 years and we were supposed to have this in production 6 months ago and we have no more money, but can you fix this? And, our line was, yes, our job is to suck less than the last people. But the problem that you're out of money and your past time is not our problem. That was their problem.
Yeah.
We'll suck less than them, but we need to kind of reset this. And it would set the tone of like, people would be like, yep, I get it. Let's figure this
Yeah.
out. I met Len kind of randomly through a company that his company had acquired. That was a company called Allcom that we had done some work with in Boston. They were a cabling company. So when you set up a network in the 1990s, you used to have to actually cable the buildings and put the cable in the walls, which was no easy feat. So they were like specialized companies that did that. And Allcom was a good company. And Jim, the guy that ran it, had become a friend. And he called me one day and said, hey, we just got bought by this company in Stamford, Connecticut. And, the chair's coming, the founder's coming to Boston to do some stuff. And can I take you out to lunch with him? I said, yeah, sure. Why not? Free lunch. And I met Len and I spent like the first half of the discussion, like not having any idea why Len was sitting here. He's this older guy. He's kind of wearing his, sport coat and his tie. He's kind of a little formal, not overly so. He's pretty accessible, asking me a lot of questions about what we did. We're having a nice conversation. And at the end of the conversation, he said to me, Brad, Jim has said really amazing things about you. Jim Galvin was the guy's name. Jim has said really amazing things about you. And I really like, what you guys are doing. And we'd like to buy your company. And I looked at her, I said, you know anything about it? My company says, Brad, I learned enough in the first 30 minutes about you to know that I want you to be part of my company. And, that generated a long conversation and a negotiation. We ended up buying the company. But like for me, that was such an unbelievably aha moment because I never thought about buying a company or selling our company or anything like that. I was just running a business. And what happened over time with Len was not that wasn't impulsive. I mean, he knew what he wanted. He wanted to buy he was buying companies that were systems integrators, companies that would sell hardware and install network. And this was at a point in time where you could still make 30% gross margin selling hardware. And there were a whole bunch of companies that did that sort of thing. They were called systems integrators, I think was what became the name, but there was a name before that. It was mostly Novell NetWare for the old people in the audience. Microsoft Windows NT hadn't really become a thing yet. There was no internet. It was hard. It didn't work very well. Most people sucked at it. And he knew what he wanted, what we saw and what he wanted was he wanted to buy a small company that could write software and do the services thing. And we were very profitable. So we had a good business and we were making good money. And he sort of looked at it and said, I could build off of this somehow. And I want, this guy, Brad, I want him on team. That started, a long relationship where I ended up on the deal team with him and his partner, Jerry Pock. I was the technical guy. So I learned how to do deals by watching them do deals. It was in 1994. So I took most of the money that I made and I made a bunch of angel investments in companies at the beginning of the commercial internet, including some with Len and Jerry. And I had no idea how to do an angel investment. And all of a sudden I was doing, an angel investment a month, which today is not that fast, but in the 1990s was unheard of that somebody would do more than a couple of angel investments a year. And I just used Len's approach. I'd meet with anyone and I'd sit down and within 15 minutes, I'd decide whether or not I really wanted to work with the person or not. And for me, the parameters were, do I have interest in what they're doing? Do I care about the product? And do I want to be partners with the person? And that was it. There was no I need to do diligence and kind of see your financials. These were raw startups. These were ideas. They were little baby things. And I would say that was something I learned so deeply from Len, which is be willing to take risks on people, but make your judgment quickly based on whatever your format is. And then put energy into it and see where it goes, which of course is a core part of my own personal philosophy around being willing to put energy into things without knowing where they're going to go. I don't have to define transactionally what the dynamic is. The other thing that I'll just say about Len is he was the kind of person who, no matter what was going on, no matter how hard it was, he just got up and did the work. And he had enormous success. He had a huge following of people, that from his wife, that would do anything, for him or with him. And that loyalty didn't come from him demanding loyalty at all, saying you must be
Mm.
loyal. It just from behaving in a way that engendered people want to be with him, want to spend time with him, want to be helpful. And he was incredibly generous with his time, his energy, his emotion. He took on hard problems. He was willing to deal with confrontations. He had some broken relationships, as we all do, as I do, as anybody does. That's life. You're going to have some relationships that break. But he just, no matter what was going on, he just kind of got up and was willing to do the work and willing to engage. And the positive side of that was in the joyful moments, they were wonderful. And in the difficult moments, he and I had many of them in one of our companies that we did together that, went public and it was worth over $3 billion at one point and then went bankrupt 2 years after the internet bubble crashed. I mean, we'd have days where at the end of the day, like all you could do is go for he loved to smoke cigars, just go for a walk and he'd smoke a cigar and, you'd whine a little about how shitty the day was and how hard this was, that was. And then you'd get done with the walk and you'd sit down and like, what, get back up tomorrow morning and try again. And like just that tone of recognizing this life thing, it's full of good things and it's full of hard things. It's just life. Do your best.
Yeah. Was he someone who you admired the whole picture of their life? Or was this something that's like, I feel like it's always a puzzle when you're kind of choosing mentors of like, do I admire this person's talent in their domain? Or do I even appreciate all the trade-offs that they've made in the whole picture of their life and respect and want sort of the big puzzle that they put together, not just one particular trait that they've over-optimized on?
It's a lovely question. A whole picture of his life. I became good friends with his son, David.
Hmm.
And David, and I love the relationship that he and David had. I saw how he dealt with really difficult personal situations, including the passing of both his first wife passed of cancer, and then the second wife also passed of cancer many years later. And, I watched him deal with Bunny having cancer and then subsequently passing, and just, the love and grace at which he dealt with that. He was very comfortable in his own skin, right? He didn't have to be the richest guy on the block. He didn't have to be the most successful guy on the block. He didn't have to be, the most whatever. He knew what he wanted and he focused on that rather than something artificial that somebody else maybe wanted or that he thought he should have because. Now, the whole picture, my answer is I'm not emulating Len. I'm being my own person, but in the context of that and in terms of how he interacted with people over a long period of time, even in situations that were challenging, lovely is the word I used a few minutes ago. It was lovely.
Yeah.
It was inspiring. And it wasn't like, oh, he was such a humble guy. He had so much humility, blah, blah, blah. It wasn't that. He was just him.
Yeah.
He didn't try to be somebody else. And he evolved and grew. I mean, I got him to stop wearing ties and eventually I got him to stop wearing sport coats. And, he would pull, when I had a ponytail, he'd pull on the end of my ponytail into me. And, there was love. And it just made everything, whether it was work or not work, whether it was easy or hard, whether it was successful or not successful, whether it was short or long, like it was just, I use the word lovely. It was a lovely way of being. And, I wrote a blog post when he passed that touched on a bunch of things. And I put a picture of it of a morning we had together. And that morning I was in New York for the Fitbit IPO. I was an early investor in Fitbit. I was on the board. It was a huge IPO. It was I think it was the largest consumer products IPO since sometime in the 90s. Like for a long, long time, it was a really substantial deal. Then, internet companies, were still sort of, some companies going public, stuff like that. But for me, it was, a tremendously successful thing, but it was also just exciting. And so, I came in the night before and you have, I came in the day before and you have like the final banker meeting to price the deal and all the nonsense that goes around with that. And then you have a big party I think it was in the Rainbow Room or something, looking over Manhattan, and everybody's joyful and having a wonderful time. And I go to my hotel room, and the next morning he and I go for a walk before I went to the New York Stock Exchange, to ring the bell. And so it was early morning that the two of us got together. And we got together and I was staying at the Gramercy Park Hotel, which I stayed at regularly. And it was next to this little park called Gramercy Park. And he had gone to Baruch University. And maybe it was the morning I came in, the morning before the pricing and stuff. I can't remember exactly the time. And we met for breakfast at the hotel. And he said, Brad, I've never been to that park. I went to college across the street, but I'd never been to that park. And I said, Len, fuck it, let's go to the park. So I went to the desk and I said, is there any way we can get into the park? I'd never even really thought about the park before. They said, oh, yeah, all the hotel guests can go to the park. Here's the key.
Oh, cool.
And we went into the park and we sat on a bench for like 30 minutes. And he said, this is the greatest. I never did this. And it was a beautiful day, Manhattan sunny day. Nobody was out yet. And we just sat there and just were together. That was Len.
Yeah. It's amazing the people in our lives who can change our lives just by being themselves. Like they don't set an example that we have to emulate, but they set an example of what true happy authenticity looks like. And someone just like walking their own path. And you're like, oh yeah, that's an inspiration for me to walk my own path, not to walk yours.
You nailed it, Eric. You summarized my last 10 minutes in 30 seconds. You nailed it. It's the inspiration to be yourself, not to try to be someone else.
Yeah.
And the courage in today's world to be comfortable with yourself, whatever that is. And that's especially hard with all the stuff. I mean, it was hard when I was a kid. It's probably been hard for the beginning of our species. It's especially hard with the amount of stuff that comes at you every day.
Yeah.
All the different stuff about how to be and what you should and what you shouldn't and what's good and what's bad, all the nonsense and, the number of people who are, just whatever the bullshit that's coming out of their mouth is because they're trying to accomplish something. All right, well, whatever.
We've invented some, mimetic super weapons in the last couple of years that really, really prey on our our natural weaknesses. Are there other key mentors that were sort of inflection points in your life or that gave really important kind of pieces of who you ended up becoming?
Yeah, I had some big early ones. So my dad's younger brother, Charlie Feld, he's still a close friend, was when I was 12, I got interested in computers randomly. And Charlie was at the time the head of data processing for Frito-Lay. Today, he'd be called the CIO. He was one of the dozen or so IT leaders who invented the idea of a CIO. But at the time when I was a little kid, he was head of data processor. And, I was interested in computers. So he would take me to the, Frito-Lay data center in Dallas, where I grew up. That was this giant data center underground in downtown somewhere. And I would sit in front of a terminal. And one day it was a Saturday. He was busy. He had this bunch of meetings. And he sat me down in front of a terminal, handed me a book that on the cover was a black book with red cover. Again, old people might remember this. And the cover said A Programming Language. And the programming language was called APL, which was the TLA for a programming language. And it's the weirdest programming language that, it probably existed at that time. And if people don't know APL and you're curious, go look up APL on the web and you'll see that it had this bizarre keyboard and it was a very compact language. And in 5 or 6 hours of sitting in front of this terminal, I was absolutely amazed by what I could do by typing these keys into this thing and having this thing do stuff. And, he continued to encourage me as a teenager. And then when I went to college, I was in Boston and he would regularly come through Boston to meet with Digital Equipment Corp, DEC, Now that got bought by Compaq and then got bought by HP, right? So he'd meet with Dak, he'd meet with Lotus, which was just down the block from where I was going to school at MIT. And he'd invite me and have me sit in meetings that I had no business being in, with the leaders of these companies as a 17, 18, 19-year-old. And it wasn't like, hey, Brad, go sit in the corner and be quiet. He'd let me sit at the table. And, I wouldn't say much, but every now and then I'd ask a question, and I met these people and I really got a sense of, some of these things. And that was really powerful. I started my company about 5 years before he left Frito-Lay and then started his company.
Mm.
By the way, us Felds aren't terribly creative. So his company's name was the Feld Group. And so for a period of time, you had Feld Technologies and the Feld Group. And so he was starting his business, and all of a sudden, the magic trick of mentorship happened, which in my speaking is a mentor and the mentee become peers, and
Mm.
you start learning from each other. So all of a sudden, even though I viewed him as a mentor, now he sees me as a mentor because my business is much bigger than his, and he's asked me questions about this, that, the other thing in terms of getting the business going. And so, that was very powerful. And then subsequently, right around 1999 or 2000, I ended up when I was at SoftBank, which then became Mobius. We invested in the Feld Group, and
Oh,
I joined
amazing.
his board and joined his management company and continued to work closely with him. And then EDS bought the Feld Group at some point. It was a nice exit for everybody, a very nice exit for Charlie and the other founders of the Feld Group. And just like those experiences were powerful. So he would be one. Another were the husband and wife, Chris and Helena Aves, who had a company that was the first company I really worked for. It was a company called Petcom. And when I was a senior in high school, I got introduced to them by, I don't remember who, maybe a patient of my dad's or something. And I ended up working for them the summer of my senior year in high school. And then while I was in college, I worked part-time for them. When I started working with them, it was just the two of them. So it was the three of us. At their peak, it was a 20-something person company. And then the oil and gas boom in Texas burst. The price of oil went from I don't know, 40 down to 10 or something. And all their customers who were petroleum, oil and gas exploration companies all went out of business, and their business shrunk. But they continued to do stuff and to make it happen. I learned so much from Chris and Helena about starting a company and what being in a company as a founder looked like. And then I learned two really powerful things personally. One was they paid me by the hour. So I learned pretty quickly that if I worked 80 hours a week, I made twice as much as if I worked 40 hours a week. And they were paying me the princely sum at the time of $10 an hour, for writing commercial software for them, which just a job I loved. I mean, I would stay in this office that we had till 2 a.m, in front of my PC writing software. And I actually, I was an all-nighter kid for a while I was
Mm.
in college. I'd do an all-nighter once a week. So when I would come in the summers and work for them, I'd always spend one night a week and stay in the office and pull an all-nighter. And they'd always come in and they'd wake me up. I'd be asleep on a couch somewhere. But the other thing I learned is they gave me 5% royalty on my software. They didn't give me equity in the company. I didn't really know what equity was, but they gave me 5% royalty, which was common in the oil and gas industry. And all of a sudden in college, I was getting checks for $1,000, $2,000. I got a check once for a little bit over $10,000 because they sold a
Wow.
bunch of my products. Hey, your freshman in college, you get a check for $10,000. Well, what do you do? Oh, I took my entire fraternity out to Chinese food across the street, and I still had $8,000 left. Right. So it gave me this sort of different view of money at a relatively young age in
Yeah.
terms of, instead of viewing, the job in a certain way, I sort of
Well,
said, oh, I can be creative. I can create these things.
you experienced
And
leverage like
that's right. Get
very
creative,
early.
get paid for it in a way that is linked to the thing that's done. So I could give a handful more others, but those are some that jump out at me.
Was Len the? It's no secret that this is all probably a lead up to your most recent book, which is Give First, and it's all about the power of mentorship. But was Len the sort of original inspiration for that? Has this book been brewing for a while? What's the origin story?
No, so the dynamics around this book was in 2012, or the way the orientation of the book happened. This is my 9th book. So in 2012, I wrote this book called Startup Communities, and that was my 3rd book. In that book, I created the phrase startup community. It didn't exist before that. People called them entrepreneurial ecosystems and innovation, something inaccessible to people. And I'm like, need a better phrase. And I talked about a bunch of things in that book about how to create startup communities anywhere in the world. Like my view was this whole idea that you had to be in the Bay Area to create a startup was stupid. I was tired of hearing it. I was involved in something different, right? I grew up in Dallas. I lived in Boston. I now lived in Colorado. I created this thing, Techstars, that was now investing in companies all over the world. I personally invested all over the US with the venture fund I was part of Foundry Group. And I'm like, you know what? I want to put a wrapper around this. And I used Boulder as the example and what was happening in Boulder, Colorado at the time. In that book was one paragraph. It's a short paragraph. And the heading of the paragraph was "Give Before You Get."
Mm.
And I wrote that paragraph as an afterthought. I didn't really put a lot into it, but I was trying to say with that paragraph, look, if you're a leader in a startup community, and I defined leaders in that book as the founders, entrepreneurs, and you want to be a leader in a startup community, you have to just be willing to put energy into the startup community without knowing what you're going to get back. And I'd say it's not altruistic. It's not philanthropic. You expect to get something back. You just don't know when, from whom, over what time period, in what form, and what consideration. And so I wrote this paragraph. I didn't really think much about it. That paragraph, had some pickup. There were a lot of conversations as the book came out, and people were talking about startup communities everywhere. Come on, we got to put energy into the startup community. Give before you get, sort of. And then about 6 months later, Adam Grant came out with a book called Give and Take. And I didn't know Adam at the time. And I read his book, and I'm like, holy shit. Adam was or is a Wharton professor. He's an organizational psychologist. Like, he did real research. My book had no research. It was just Brad Feld anecdotes and experiences, which is all what I do. Like, I conceptual frameworks, but it's stuff from my experience.
Yeah.
Disagree with it? Tell me you disagree with it. You don't like it? Challenge it. It could be wrong. It's just experiences that I've had. And I tried to frame stuff around that. But Adam had this book that was extraordinarily readable. The first character that he talks about is a guy, Dave Hornick, who I also knew as an example of somebody who was a giver. And he defined givers, takers, and matchers. And he did this academic research that showed that over the long run, the most successful people, he actually did it really well. It's a good hook. He says, after he sets it up, over the long run, the people who are the least successful are givers. And he said, and the people who are most successful are givers.
Interesting.
And then, the book talks about what are the characteristics that separate the most successful from least successful, and where do takers fit, and matchers are people, I'll give you this if you give me that, or I'll do this for you if you do this. And I read this book. I'm like, yep, there's a thing here. And this is how I'm behaving. And I thought about it. And there were other people in my world that behaved that way. Len was one of them, like in terms of personality and style, but there were others. David Cohen, who was one of the co-founders of Techstars, was behaving this way in how he engaged. A lot of it was philosophical and conversations that we had with each other about how Techstars should grow and evolve at the time. And then one day at some Techstars event, I remember there used to be this thing called Twitter, and everybody used it. And it used to be limited to 140 characters, including the hashtag.
Yeah.
And hashtag give before you get kind of uses up a lot of those 140 characters. So a guy named Greg Cochran at Techstars one day was at a Techstars event and started tweeting hashtag give first in front of stuff. And then all of a sudden that became give first.
Yeah.
For me, so that was kind of the origin. This is, 2012, 2013, 2014. And it was kind of a consolidation of some ideas that then evolved. And it evolved into, I describe it very clearly today as a philosophy, not a religion. A religion has rules. If you follow the rules, if you're Buddhist, if you follow the rules, you're not going to get it right. And then when you die, you get reincarnated and get to do it all over again. For other religions, if you follow the rules, you go to heaven or whatever. And it doesn't matter what your religious tradition is, there are rules.
Yeah.
And for me, mentorship's not about rules. It's about ideas, and it's about ways of being, and it's about things that are effective versus things that are not effective. Give first is not, here's how you have to behave 100% of the time. It's, here's a philosophy. And I'll just give an example. I mean, the tongue-in-cheek thing that happens periodically is somebody will say to me, oh, you're that give first VC. How about you give me $5 million and I'll give you something. And I'm like, no. I have transactions in my world too. But you take a part of your framing and your philosophy as I'm willing to put energy into things without knowing where they'll go. And all of these things evolved over time. And I would say about 3 years ago, I wrote the first draft of this
Mm.
book. And when I wrote it, it was still COVID. I was tired. I was pretty tired of a bunch of stuff. And when I say it was still COVID, the lockdowns were off, but there was still a COVID hangover in the air. I was tired of a bunch of stuff that was going on in the world. I was tired of some stuff going on in venture specifically. And I was just kind of worn out of a public persona of talking, doing stuff like this, being in public and things like that. And after I wrote this first draft, what happened was I got feedback, which I always get. I sent it out to 20 people or so. And there were two big pieces of feedback. One was, Brad, you jammed together two ideas, give first and mentorship. You didn't really weave them together into a coherent narrative.
Mm.
And the other was, hey, way too many Techstars stories, not enough Brad stories. Like, we want to hear more like from your experience, which was kind of an obvious thing for somebody to tell me, but I hadn't really, I kind of got lazy in the writing of it. So I knew what to do because I'd taken a lot of first drafts to a book that was good, a lot of mediocre to crummy first drafts to a good book. And I'm like, you know what? Fuck it. I don't feel like doing the work right now. And then I'm like, you know what? Fuck it. I feel like taking summer vacation. And so I stopped doing everything public. I continued to do all my work, but I stopped blogging. I stopped doing podcasts. I stopped writing. I stopped whatever, tweeting. I stopped all social media, everything. And then summer vacation turned into fall. And then the next summer, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do another. I like this. I'm enjoying this. And I eventually came up with a label for it, which I called hibernation. So I hibernated for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And then when David Cohen came back as Techstars CEO about 15 months ago or so, I told him, hey, David, I'll engage really deeply to help you with everything going on around Techstars, but I don't want to have any public stuff. I'm staying in hibernation. It's like totally cool. And, engage deeply with him on a bunch of stuff. I took the book off the shelf. And I just read through the digital version of this mediocre first draft. I'm like, there's good shit in here.
Yeah.
And let me see if I can turn this into a good book. So I spent the last half of last year doing that. And then when I finished, I felt really like, I want to get this book out in the world. And then I decided, if I'm going to put this book out in the world, like putting it out in the world, not putting it in your hands, it's kind of stupid. So I decided to come out of hibernation, but for a finite amount of time. And so I'm going back into hibernation. At midnight on Halloween, I turn into a pumpkin just to mix metaphors. And, maybe it's for a couple of months, maybe it's a couple of years, maybe it's for the duration. I don't know. But it's been fun and gratifying to be involved in this for the last 6 months, or it's really been the last 4 months when we're doing this. Been gratifying and interesting because it's forced me to think about some of these ideas and some of the philosophy and really turn it into something more tangible.
Yeah, I like the idea of treating it like a season. Like it's burnout if you try to live your life that way. But I'm glad you're out of hibernation. Like for this conversation, certainly. But I think there's a lot of people that spend their whole lives hiding, like hoarding their lessons instead of sharing them. And so I'm very grateful when people are open with what they've learned. I'm curious, as like both a burgeoning author and a burgeoning investor, like what the role of books has been in your career as we kind of close this out. I think that's a fun way to like tie it all together. Like you've written a lot of books, you've done a ton of investing, started multiple funds, started a fund of funds. Like how has being an author impacted your investing career and vice versa?
Books are core to so many things I do. I have been a reader since I was a little kid. I don't know when I first started reading, but young single digits. One of my favorite things to do as a preteen and teen. So go back to your preteen and teen years. One of my favorite things to do is lay on my bed. Now I do it on a couch and read. And I like to read all kinds of stuff. I like to read science fiction. I like to read fiction. I like to read nonfiction. I used to love to read biographies. Now I read Wikipedia. Every now and then I'll read a biography if I'm really interested in the person. I love to read stuff that I know nothing about, whether it's philosophy or science or whatever. I like to read things from people I know, especially friends.
Yeah.
I try not to get stuck in ruts. And so I realized, for example, that the science fiction that I was reading was all written by men. And at some point I realized, there weren't that many, when I realized that there weren't that many women who wrote science fiction. It was more, when you ran into it, it was more fantasy, but all of a sudden there were some women really amazing women writing science fiction. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to not for a while read science fiction from men. I'm just going to read from women. And it was interesting to like have the shift. So, I try to be all over the place in terms of what I cover. For people that are interested in what I read, I log it all in Goodreads. Pay no attention to my stars. My stars are 5 stars if I finished a book, 4 stars if I started skimming the book, and 3 stars if I didn't finish the book. Because I think the star system is useless. So I just use it for myself. As a writer, the inverse of it is I figured out a while ago, I started blogging in 2004. My wife, Amy, is also a writer.
Mm.
So words really are like a central part of a lot of what we do. And of course, I write a lot of email as a professional investor and all the work I've done. But I started writing, and at some point I realized that I love to write in the same way I love to read. And for me, idea processing happens while I'm reading and writing, not while I'm talking,
Mm.
not while I'm listening. So listening and talking is what I like to describe as idea reinforcement.
Hmm.
So it solidifies the ideas that I have. If it's a new idea and the first time I run into it as a lecture, it's really hard for me.
Hmm.
If somebody has PowerPoint slides up on the screen or slides up on the screen and they have words on them and they're talking, I can't do both. I have to either listen or I have to read the words. So I realized that at some point. I'm like, wow, the writing is connected. And then there's a through line all the way back to when I wrote software. I loved writing software, loved it. And as a hobby, I'm about to turn 60. As a hobby, I'm doing it again. And so I'm now writing software again, which is just a blast, especially with contemporary tooling and using AI as essentially a pair programmer. I think a lot of people talk about it as AI agents and vibe coding. And it's really, it's analogous to me as having a pair programming setup where there's 2 people in front of one computer and one person happens to have their fingers on the keys and one person saying, this is what, we should do next, and reading and looking at it all. And the AI is actually the one with the keys, and they type a lot faster than I type. And they get a lot, they get plenty of things wrong, but they get a lot of things right a lot faster than I'm going to get them right. And all of these things are linked. So reading and writing, whether writing is nonfiction, fiction, blog posts, code, and reading for me are a broad arc around learning and creating. And so they're very interconnected in that.
Mm-hmm.
And the talking and listening is not that part of learning for me. It's the reinforcing and solidifying and knocking the edges off some of the ideas. The other thing, Amy and I, we don't have kids. And, going back to when I was a kid, one of my favorite things to do with Amy is both of us lay on our own separate couches and read. And
Yeah.
so many evenings, especially as we're getting older and becoming less social or maybe more antisocial, more and more of our evenings, having had a lifetime supply of fancy restaurants, I never have to go to a fancy restaurant again. I've had enough. I am happy to every now and then, but it's not like core and central. I love the idea of just like laying on a couch and reading for a couple hours till I get tired and then going to sleep.
Yeah.
So these things overlap, and I maybe end with this idea of books. The arc of creating books, which of course now with what you're doing on a daily basis with Scribe, the idea of being with other people who go through the creation process. If you've never written a book, this won't mean anything to you. If you've written a book, it's really fucking hard. And it's like, no matter how many you've done, it's still really fucking hard. And, now the production of it's like, there's parts of it that are not like starting with nothing and making something that actually is any good is really hard.
And
Making
having the
something
confidence to put it out, even if you think it's good, you're just afraid other people won't. Yeah.
yeah, okay, great. So now you wrote the book. Now what?
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of stuff to do. Like, wow, that's a lot. So, like somebody says, well, you make any money off your books? It's like, it doesn't matter. Like, that's not why you do it. You do it for
Yeah.
other reasons. And people have very clear reasons. And sure, of course, some people make money off books, and I've made some money off some of the books, like Venture Deals, which has been a hugely successful book. Have made some money. It's not relative to the other things I could have spent the time on. Probably not. A lot of people create books as a platform for whatever it is they do. A lot of people write books for ego reasons. For me, I write books to understand better an idea
Hmm.
and work out the idea. I write blog posts to work out an idea. Not every blog post is this deep intellectual work out an idea. A lot of blog posts that I write are crappy and stupid. Some of them are fluffy and fun. Some of them don't make any sense. A lot of them have a nugget or two that I can then keep pulling out and teasing on.
Yeah.
For me, writing in public has been always more fun than writing in private. I've tried doing it in private. It's not as satisfying to me, partly because it doesn't feel as committed.
Mm.
For me, when I write in private, I kind of like, when I write in public, there's a little different piece for me that somehow it doesn't make me try to get it better, but it makes me think a little harder about the idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it gives you surface area to create new relationships and test those ideas and refine them and find your people based on them. Yeah. It's rewarding.
Well, that's such a great comment. I just wrote the blog post I wrote today was about reading some books over the weekend from some friends. So I
Mm.
really love reading books from friends. I read a lot of books before they get published. Whenever a friend publishes a book, I buy a copy. I read it. I put up my 5 stars next to their name on Goodreads and Amazon on the review because all authors love, more reviews. But in the essence of it, it is like a different layer of connection. I mean, you and I don't have a super deep relationship, but when we show up in the same place, oh, it's a little different because we both written books, and I've written a book on your platform before you owned the platform. So I wrote a book in old version of Scribe,
Hmm.
and just like I know what matters to you. When I talk to Ryan Holiday, I know what matters to him.
Yeah.
When one of my business partners at Foundry, his wife Greeley Sachs created a bookstore, owns a bookstore in Longmont.
Mm. Cool.
You don't do that unless you love books,
Yeah.
right? And if you love books, that's cool. That's a category. And, by the way, anybody listening that writes books, has written books, loves books, wants to talk to somebody else about books, brad@feld.com. Send me a note. I love people who write books. And, see if I'm full of shit or not, that I read a lot. You don't have to send me your book. Send me the link to your book and I'll buy it. And then I'll send you the receipt to show you that I actually buy books from people that I know. It's just woven into the fabric.
Yeah.
It helps me think and be in a way that's satisfying. And maybe I'll end with, I probably should have the history, but, the Gutenberg press changed the world. Right. And there was, 1400, some 1500, 600 years ago, 700 years ago. And people say, well, books will be obsolete, whatever. Maybe, I don't know. AIs will take over. Okay, whatever. I don't care. I got somewhere between a day left and 30 years left on this planet. I think books are going to matter until I expire. So, you know, if they stop mattering before I expire, okay, well, that's life. But I'm going to let it be a joyful part of mine until I expire.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time, sharing your stories, sharing stories of Len, all the sharing that you do and all the things that you founded that help other people kind of find their path and for the inspiration to be ourselves. Appreciate you very much.
Thanks for having me, Eric. And thanks for being you and doing everything you're doing at Scribe. It's great.